In this video, let's go through the major points in the preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads written by William Wordsworth. Wordsworth, as you know, is an English romantic poet and critic. He was also a nature poet and had been awarded the title of a poet laureate. The reason why we are so familiar with Wordsworth is because of his contribution to the poetry genre. He, along with Mr. Coleridge, is credited with launching the Romantic movement into English literature. Some of his major works include the Lyrical Ballads, Daffodils, the Immortality Ode, the Prelude, and the Solitary Reaper. I had just mentioned that Wordsworth is such a major writer because of launching the Romantic movement. To understand what is this romantic movement, romanticism, you also have to understand what is neoclassicism, which was the style adopted by the writers in the period that came before Wordsworth. During the neoclassical period, the writers had to follow strict and rigid rules. Their writing style was very formal. They also used a very ornamented language, that is with lot of metaphors and similes and other poetic diction. Most importantly, they focused on the intellect rather than the emotion. You must note that the neoclassical writers are called so because they tried to imitate the classical writers. So their works were written in such a way that only highly educated people could understand their poetry. As a complete contrast to this, Wordsworth and Coleridge brought Romanticism. Here, the poet could decide what kind of rules he had to apply in his poems. The poet had the liberty to do that. Also, he used simple forms of expression and emotion was given more importance than intellect. Now, when poems were written with such simplicity, even the common people could understand the meaning behind a poem. Now you know the difference between neoclassicism and romanticism. Now let's see how romanticism was introduced into England. The 19th century writers Wordsworth and Coleridge felt that neoclassical writings were very artificial. So they both decided to introduce a new style of writing, and for this they made a collection of poems and titled it the Lyrical Ballads. Now, the poems in this collection was very different from the earlier style of writing. The poems were written in the common man's language, which was easily understandable to the ordinary man, and it was also written about ordinary life experiences. Thus, Lyrical Ballads became a beginning for a new movement called the Romantic movement. Now, when Lyrical Ballads was published in 1798, it did not have any preface. Later on, in the second edition, which was published in 1801, Wordsworth added a preface to this Lyrical Ballads. And this preface contained all the information about this new style of poetry that Wordsworth and Coleridge had introduced through this collection. Thus, the preface published in the second edition, which is also called the 1800 edition, is called the Manifesto of English Romantic Movement. Two more editions of the Lyrical Ballads were published later with revised prefaces, but what is important for us is the preface of the second edition. Now, before explaining his poetic ideas, Wordsworth tells us why he decided to write this preface. He says, when Lyrical Ballads was published, the first edition was published, Wordsworth and Coleridge were only experimenting with this new style of poetry. This first edition of Lyrical Ballads was published as an experiment to see how the readers will receive these poems. But luckily, after the publication of Lyrical Ballads, more people than expected approved this type of poetry. Thus, Wordsworth felt that he should give an introduction to his poems. He should explain his ideas more clearly, and thus he wrote the preface in the second edition. Just note that even though the second edition was published in 1801, we call it the 1800 edition. After describing why Wordsworth had to write the preface, he goes on explaining what is this new genre of poetry. The aim of the poems in the lyrical ballads or romantic poems in general is to portray low and rustic life, that is, the life of the common people, and this life is portrayed using real language of men. So, the life of the common people is being shown through these poems by using the language which they speak in their day to day life. And topics are not simply taken from the ordinary life and depicted as it is. Instead, the poet uses his imagination in order to give it a little coloring. And with this coloring of imagination, the poet could generate a state of excitement in the reader without unnecessary ornamentation. According to Wordsworth, ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. Okay, so we just saw that Wordsworth stresses on the importance of using ordinary, common, day to day language. So, why is this real language of men important? He gives explanation for that too. He says rustics or the common people convey their notions in simple and unelaborated expressions. They use a language that is under less restraint, far away from social vanity. That is, unlike the so called educated civilized people, rustic people are not concerned about what they speak. They only want their feelings to be expressed, and that is expressed in a very simple manner. Also, the rustics live in close connection with nature, and thus their feelings are more comprehensible, relatable, and more durable. Even Wordsworth is of the opinion that the best parts of language have originated from them and their language is more philosophical. So, here, when neoclassicals were thinking that the philosophical language comes from the educated people, from highly sophisticated languages, Wordsworth and Coleridge, they believed that the rustics, the common people, it is from them that we get the best language. Their language is the most philosophical one. As I just said, the neoclassical poets believed that elaborate language gave poetry high standards, whereas Wordsworth believed that the language of common people is more philosophical than the ornamented language. Wordsworth mentions that he doesn't approve of instant gratification in poems. Now, this is a trend that got into the English poetry when the industrialization came into England. During those times, a lot of technological progress developments were taking place that people did not have the patience to wait and read and understand a poem. They wanted instant gratification. And this is what all the other poets tried to give them through their poems too. Wordsworth, on the other hand, is asking the readers to find beauty in the common things with the help of the poet. And he says, lofty language or too much decorated language alienates the reader and has trouble connecting to their lived experience. Now Wordsworth explains how should a poet write a poem? What is the process of poetic creation? Firstly, there should be an experience that acts as a raw material to create a poem. Poetry must be written after a serious emotional experience. The second step is recollection. As soon as one had a serious emotional experience, one should not sit down and write it as a poem because at that particular moment, a lot of emotions might be overwhelming or confusing. So, the emotions must be recalled in tranquility. Okay, so now the poet have had an serious emotional experience and he sat and recollected about it. The next thing he should do is filter these emotions and feelings. He should clear the mind of non-essential elements. Take only what is necessary for the poem. The last step would be to compose a poem in a pleasurable way using the poet's imagination. Hence, the process of poetic creation should include a serious emotional experience which should be recalled in tranquility and then cleared of non essential elements and finally composed into a poem in a pleasurable way and thus have a noticeable effect on the reader. And that's how Wordsworth asks the poet to create a poem. If this is how poetry should be written, then what is poetry? Poetry, we know, must emerge from spontaneous emotions, but it should be written after a long and deep reflection. Thus, according to Wordsworth, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility, the most important lines of this essay. Poetry must be spontaneous, it should reflect our feelings, but it should be written after a recollection in tranquility. Again, more than the experience itself, the feelings are more important. After this, Wordsworth talks about the purpose of poetry. According to him, poems are not simply for entertainment, it also has a moral purpose. That is, poems should be serious, they should teach the readers moral and philosophical values and ideals. Now, what can we say about the style of these poems? We already know that romantic poems are not artificial or over decorated and thus they are different from the neoclassical poems. Other than that, there are two major points that Wordsworth notes when he talks about the style. Firstly, the personifications of abstract ideas rarely occur in romantic poems. What are abstract ideas? Something that we have to think and understand. It's not something that you can point at and show that this is what I'm talking about. So, such ideas are rarely used in romantic poems. Instead, Coleridge and Wordsworth tried to use a language that is relatable and realistic to the ordinary man. They used the language of the common men. Secondly, almost no poetic diction has been used in these poems. Wordsworth says, pains has been taken to avoid it as is ordinarily taken to produce it. So it's interesting to note that an effort has been put while writing these poems in order to not use these poetic dictions that usually neoclassical writers were so fascinated about. Wordsworth says that he couldn't use some beautiful phrases in his poems because he had to use the language of the common men. But that doesn't make him very desperate to use these phrases because he was very frustrated that many beautiful phrases were overused by the poets and had lost their original meaning. There are certain criteria to be a poet. Firstly, he says, poets do not write for poets alone but for men. And the other qualities are, he should have a knowledge on human nature. And a poet should consider man and nature as essentially adapted to each other. We are interconnected. Man and nature are not two separate entities. A poet should be able to conjure in him passions which resemble passions produced by real events. He should also have a language that reflects the language of all other men. Now we will move on to a very important part of this essay where Wordsworth talks about poetry and prose. He says, most critics disapprove of poems that are written similar to prose. Even we as readers used to feel the same. When you take a poetic piece, you expect it to have some particular qualities. It's not simply breaking down a prose piece into lines. But Wordsworth, on the other hand, feels that diction of poetry and prose is almost the same. He even argues that some of the most interesting parts of the best poems will be found to be strictly in the language of prose. And as an example, he gives his analysis of Gray's sonnet. Wordsworth says that in Thomas Gray's sonnet on the death of Richard West, some of the best lines that he saw was not different from that of prose. The argument put forward by Wordsworth is that there neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. Poetry is just prose written in meter. And then he gives some metaphorical comparisons to explain this point. Now, this is very ironic because he was not in favor of poetic diction or ornamented language, but in the critical essay that we are studying, we find that Wordsworth often uses metaphors and similes in order to explain his points. Wordsworth says both poetry and prose, they both speak by and to the same organs. Their affections are kindred and almost identical, to not necessarily differing even in degree. And poetry sheds no tears such as angels weep, but natural and human tears. He's just saying that they are exactly the same. This leads to a question: if poetry and prose are exactly the same as Wordsworth claims, then why should Wordsworth write poems when he could have written prose? Wordsworth gives an explanation to this too. He chose poetry because of metrical language that can be used when one writes poems. According to him, metrical language is much more charming. Even the simplest of things, when conveyed with meter, contains a certain charm. He feels that metrical language will lead to pleasure, the pleasure which the mind derives from the perception of similitude in dissimilitude. Now, he hasn't explained what he means by this quoted line, but he might have meant to present something very usual in an unusual way will give the readers pleasure. And metrical language will help with that. Thus, he believes that the verse will be read 100 times, whereas prose is read once. When he concludes his essay, he makes it clear that he is not compelling his readers to like what he has wrote. He is just giving an introduction to these poems, and he also asks the reader to independently judge these poems based on their own feelings and not make judgments based on others' opinions. He also fully understands that if the poems of lyrical ballads are well accepted, that will be the growth of this new genre of poetry. And obviously, this is what he calls genuine poetry. Even though Wordsworth continuously claims that he doesn't force his readers to like his poems, when you go through his essay, you will find that there is a fear of rejection in him. It is also interesting to note that some points that Wordsworth has mentioned in the preface are criticized by Coleridge in his Biographia Literaria. Even though Wordsworth and Coleridge had together written the Lyrical Ballads, there are several disagreements between them regarding the preface. And it is said that it was Coleridge who was supposed to write the preface, but somehow Wordsworth ended up writing it. As of now, the preface is considered to be a very important critical essay, and it is also called the Manifesto of Romantic Movement. That's all for this video. If this video was useful to you, please don't forget to subscribe.